One afternoon, I found myself in a predicament only someone stuck on watch duty in a crumbling tower could face. My bladder was about to overflow with the synthetic buzz of Neurocola, a neon-pink energy drink notorious for turbocharging your system and overstaying its welcome. From my perch in Tower 4, I scanned the grid below for anyone, who could cover my post, but the streets were empty, save for the occasional flicker of holograms in the haze. "Great," I muttered, tapping into my ocular HUD to highlight potential movement zones. Nothing. Not even a shadow. Plan B was a quick dive into the corner to find an empty flask or, hell, even a discarded smart canteen. But a search of the cramped tower turned up zilch. Not a container in sight that could handle this payload. Stepping outside into the smog-filled air wasn't exactly regulation, but desperate times. From the rooftop, I could see a group of my squad mates huddled by the pit, probably calibrating their kinetic rifles. Lately, the brass insisted we drill more often. Downtime was apparently an enemy too. I shrugged. This wasn't a drill. This was survival. The catch? Drones and cyber snipers patrolled the sector like clockwork, and letting your guard, or pants, down was asking to be immortalized in someone's kill cam highlight reel. But nihilism has a funny way of dulling self-preservation. I muttered under my breath, if anyone manages a direct shot, they can engrave it on my gravestone. Standing at the edge of the platform, I made peace with my questionable decision. Just as I started to take care of business, a faint buzz zipped past my ear. My reflexes kicked in, maybe too late, and my implants flagged the object with a low-priority warning. A rock? It hit the ground with a metallic clink, bounced off my cyber boots, and skidded out of sight. What the hell? I muttered, just as another rock narrowly missed me. This time, I wasn't letting it slide. I bent down, snatched a piece of rubble, and whirled around to spot the culprit. Below, the group had split apart, leaving the unmistakable figure of Command Sergeant Major, Bird Dog, Vargas dead center, lobbing rocks like it was target practice. "Get back inside, Vane," he roared, punctuating his command with another well-aimed projectile. "Copy that, Command," I yelled back, bolting to cover with my dignity barely intact. The old man had impeccable timing, like a malfunctioning surveillance bot that only activates when you're doing something stupid. A few cycles later, after the outpost had been shuttered, I crossed paths with Bird Dog again, this time at Corregidor Station's Chow Hall. The newsfeed was buzzing about the latest Neuralink device, a first-gen prototype that people swore would change their lives. I scoffed, as if we weren't already shackled to enough tech. Finishing my synth coffee, I got up to dump my tray and head for the exit. That's when it hit me, a tingling sensation down my spine, as if my Neuralink had just flagged a critical error. Scanning the room, I locked eyes with Vargas. His gaze sliced through the ambient holograms like a monomolecular blade. "Shit," I whispered. His smirk said it all. I'd screwed up. But how? I did a quick mental diagnostic, cross-referencing potential violations. Uniform misalignment? No. Grooming infractions? Highly doubtful. Was I out of regulation for combat mods? My internal checklist came up empty. Then it hit me. My M77 smart rifle was still propped against the chair where I'd been sitting. "Great job, Astra," I muttered, spinning on my heel to grab it. If there's one universal rule in any tactical unit, it's that moving without a weapon is an insult to the gods of war and to every commander worth their salt. Grabbing my rifle, I turned back toward Vargas with a casual salute. "Morning, Command." He nodded approvingly, his cybernetic eye glinting faintly. Message received. I wouldn't get off this easy next time. In the world I call home, the rules are simple. If you're moving, you're a threat. If you're standing still, you're planning how to become one. And none of that works if your weapon's back at the table, gathering dust. I grabbed my smart rifle, its neural uplink reconnecting with a satisfying hum, and walked past Command Sergeant Vargas, flashing a wry smile. "Morning, Command," I said, keeping my tone casual. He gave a curt nod, his augmented eye flickering briefly. Vargas wasn't just watching me anymore. By now, he knew exactly who I was, knew I'd been blending into the background for most of my service. Maybe I was getting too comfortable, but comfort was dangerous and I knew it. The next day, reality came crashing down, literally. Outside Tower 4, we faced the unenviable task of dealing with a decade's worth of garbage piled high against the walls. The scent? A pungent cocktail of synthetic preservatives, decayed rations, and biowaste containers discarded by countless patrols before us. And guess who got to clean it all? Us, the unlucky final rotation. Scaling the wall to pick through the mess, I couldn't help but feel the layers of history buried in the detritus. Energy drink cans marked with old Corp logos, shattered servo chips from discarded bots, and yes, those infamous bio bottles tossed by board guards. Some of the trash dated back to the 2040s, when this district saw its first waves of urban warfare. Back then, it was the Marines running ops here, and their legacy still clung to the place like bad AR graffiti. Speaking of the Marines, they came back through on their way out of the sector, filing past us with all the arrogance their cyber-armored swagger could muster. Overheard in the break zone, one of them griped about their deployment, calling it too long. 9 months, they said. I couldn't decide if I wanted to laugh or hit them with the butt of my rifle. 9 months? Try 14 in this Hell's Cape, where you could count the clean water days on one hand. But there I was, surrounded by 50 Marines, so I swallowed my pride and just muttered to myself about how the world had no sense of justice. At least there were distractions. Back at base, the downtime usually involved every Joe scrambling for a chance to connect with someone, anyone, on the latest holodating app. Back then, we used something called Hot or Not, precursor to the hyper-curated, AI-driven romance platforms of today. It was clunky but effective enough for lonely soldiers trying to score a little human connection before heading home. I wasn't immune. My squad mates convinced me to join the chaos, and while I didn't send many messages, one photo caught my eye, a girl in a serene Japanese garden, her holo profile tagged with Air Force credentials. I sent her a DM, not expecting much. Turns out, she was as bad at responding as I was at flirting. It took 6 months for her to reply, and when we finally met in person, all my plans to play the field disintegrated. She was like me in all the ways that mattered, a fellow vet, a survivor of her own battlefield. That connection stuck. 16 years later, it's still sticking. Irony wasn't done with me, though. Just a month after my sniper-esque bathroom break on Tower 4, the Army had us stripped down to basic PT gear and haul sandbags off those same rooftops. The brass had decided we couldn't leave the base looking like a dump, as if clearing 80% of the city hadn't already done the job. So, there we were, sweeping the sand off the roof of a half-collapsed aid station. The absurdity of it wasn't lost on me. We closed down the base not long after Veterans Day, shifting operations to Corregidor Station for the final weeks of deployment. On November 19th, the battalion launched its last assault mission in Taji. The operation ended in tragedy. A weapons cache detonated during transport, killing Sergeant Daniel Shaw and leaving several others gravely injured. Among the wounded was Doc Shu, the battalion's PA. Shaw's death hit hard. He'd been stop-lossed before the deployment, only to lose his life while extended, like some cruel real-world version of the cop dies 2 days before retirement trope. It was impossible not to dwell on the what-ifs, the injustices, and the cold reality that one small change could have saved him. By the 14-month mark, I was a hollow shell of the soldier I'd been at 6 months. Back then, I loved the Army. Another 8 months had turned that love into resentment. If we'd gone home at the 6-month mark, I might have re-enlisted. But life doesn't play fair, and learning that lesson up close is another beast entirely. Thanksgiving, 2077. That week, I was assigned to guard a group of local workers dismantling Corregidor Station. They were tearing down blast walls, disassembling sentry towers, and gutting buildings of all our makeshift upgrades. The locals salvaged what they could: scrap metal, old tech, anything useful, and we paid them for their efforts. My job? Stand watch, rifle in one hand, a Marlboro in the other, and make sure no one tried anything stupid. Easy work, if you could ignore the glaring OPSEC nightmare of broadcasting our vulnerability to every hostile still lurking in the shadows. One of the laborers caught my attention, a wiry teenager with broken English and a relentless curiosity about me and my weapon. His questions came rapid fire, each one more animated than the last. The adults were quieter, though. One older man in particular had what I'd call murder eyes. His gaze burned with an intensity that spoke of years of violence, maybe against us. I didn't hold it against him. Peace is made between enemies, not friends. When our eyes met, his expression shifted. The hate melted into something almost sheepish. He smiled faintly, embarrassed to have been caught in his own memories. I smiled back, a silent truce. It's about honoring your squad, and sometimes family, with a feast, I said, adding a dramatic pause for effect. In truth, the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. This wasn't exactly a situation where family values felt like the right angle. The kid tilted his head, visibly puzzled. His augmented brow implant flickered faintly, probably processing my response like an outdated translator. I shrugged, offering a faint smirk. Don't sweat it. The final days in Ramadi cranked the tension dial past its limits. As we dismantled the perimeter defenses and pulled back to the HHC stronghold, our vulnerability ratcheted up with every piece of gear we packed away. Maneuver squads handed over their posts or simply shut them down. The streets, now eerily quiet, told their own story. It was like waiting for the axe to fall. By the end, only a skeleton crew remained. The mortar platoon, Hotel 6, and a few stragglers from HHC and battalion staff. We were the last to leave Camp Corregidor, and it felt every bit the ghost town it had become. Packing up the last of the supplies, our convoy featured a fleet of rust-streaked trucks patched together with repair kits and hope. Kazinia flagged me down as I crossed the lot. "Hey, Vane, you're driving this one," he said, pointing at an old 5-ton beast with a trailer hitched to its rear. The thing looked more like a mobile relic than a transport vehicle, its faded paint barely masking the scars of countless miles. I raised an eyebrow. "You're joking, right? I've never driven one of these monsters." "You know how to drive," though, he shot back as if that solved anything. "Technically, yeah, but I don't even have a civilian license," I countered. My tone carried just enough sarcasm to highlight the absurdity of his logic. He wasn't fazed. "Doesn't matter. You've got an army license, and that's all we need. Get in." I sighed, eyeing the monstrosity. "Fine, but it's your funeral, Papa Bear." Kazinia just grinned as he climbed into the TC seat, leaving me to wrestle with the controls of the outdated beast. Its Neuralink interface sputtered as I activated it, barely syncing with my HUD. The steering felt sluggish, like dragging a dead weight through molasses, and the trailer swayed like it had a mind of its own. My pulse spiked with every lurch and groan, but I kept it steady, mostly. As the convoy rumbled forward, dust clouds and flickering neon signs painted a surreal backdrop to our exit. It struck me then how fitting it was. My last mission in this wasteland mirrored every other one before it. I was doing something I had no business doing, under the watchful eye of someone who somehow believed I could handle it. And, just like always, the whole thing worked out in the end. Well, mostly. Driving the old 5-ton out of Corregidor felt like steering a dinosaur through a minefield. Every bump in the road made the trailer behind me wobble like a drunk mech on a caffeine overload. Kazinia sat in the TC seat, calm as a Zen monk, but I could see his cybernetic hand twitch slightly, maybe a subconscious response to the tension in the air. The convoy stretched out ahead, and behind us, a snake of battered vehicles loaded with the last remnants of our operation. My HUD pinged every few seconds, highlighting potential threats, abandoned drones, inactive ID markers, and the occasional infrared signature that turned out to be nothing more than stray dogs scavenging the ruins. But in this city, you didn't get too comfortable. A false positive one day could be your last mistake the next. "You're gripping the wheel like it owes you money, Vane," Kazinia quipped, leaning back with his arm resting on the doorframe. "Maybe it does," I shot back, loosening my hand slightly. "You try piloting this thing without an advanced vehicular interface. This neural uplink feels like it was coded by a drunken turn." "Relax," he said, his voice a strange mix of casual and commanding. "This ain't your first ride through no man's land." "Yeah, But it might be my last, I muttered under my breath, just loud enough for him to catch. He smirked but didn't reply, leaving me to wrestle the wheel as the convoy trudged along the dusty road toward TQ. The drop-off was as uneventful as it was tedious. By the time we unloaded the last of the equipment, the sun was setting, casting the city in a hazy orange glow that did little to hide its scars. Most of us lingered in silence, watching as the last pieces of our operation disappeared into storage containers. It felt surreal, like the end of an era nobody wanted to be part of in the first place. The real work came after. Once the convoy was parked and the trucks powered down, we gathered near the comms tent for what was supposed to be a simple debrief. Instead, it turned into a lesson on Murphy's Law in action. "Listen up," Vargas barked, his augmented voice box amplifying his tone just enough to keep us from zoning out. "We've got one final recon sweep to do before we clear out for good." Intel picked up some chatter about a possible AQI cell regrouping near the old industrial sector. "I need volunteers." Silence. The kind of silence you only get when a group of seasoned soldiers collectively decides that volunteering isn't in their best interest. My gut told me to stay quiet, let someone else step up. But Vargas cybernetic, I scanned the crowd, and when it locked onto me, I knew I didn't have a choice. "Vane," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You're up." I sighed, resisting the urge to roll my eyes. "Copy that, command." The industrial sector was a maze of broken catwalks, collapsed buildings, and rusted machinery that looked like it hadn't been operational in decades. The air was thick with a metallic tang, the kind that clung to your lungs and made you feel like you were breathing through a filter. Our squad moved in formation, my smart rifles targeting reticles sweeping the area as my HUD painted potential threats in faint red outlines. Beside me, Bishop, a sharpshooter with a penchant for bad jokes, kept his sniper rifle trained on the rooftops. "You ever feel like this place is alive?" he whispered through our comms channel. "Alive how?" I replied, my voice low enough to avoid echoing. "Like, it's watching us. All these broken drones and cameras, they've got to be feeding into something, right? Paranoid much?" I said, though I couldn't entirely disagree. The city had a way of making you feel like you were always being observed. "Paranoia keeps us breathing," he muttered, his rifle following a flicker of movement that turned out to be nothing more than a tarp flapping in the breeze. The first couple of hours passed without incident. We swept through abandoned factories and storage yards, finding little more than piles of scrap metal and a few discarded personal effects, mementos of lives that had long since moved on or been snuffed out. Then, just as we were preparing to call it in, my HUD lit up with a proximity alert. "Hold up," I said, raising a fist to signal the squad. "I've got movement, 20 meters northeast." Bishop swung his rifle around, his scope zooming in on the target. "I see it. Heat signature. Human. Friendly or hostile?" Vargas' voice crackled over the comms. "Hard to say," I replied, creeping forward with my rifle at the ready. "Doesn't look armed, but wait, it's moving." The figure darted into the shadows before I could get a clear look. I signaled for the squad to spread out, our boots crunching softly against the debris-strewn ground as we closed in on the last known location. What happened next was a blur. The ground beneath me gave way, a trapdoor hidden beneath a thin layer of dirt and rubble. I fell hard, landing in what felt like a maintenance shaft. Pain shot through my leg, nothing broken, but it wouldn't be winning any races anytime soon. "Vane, report," Vargas shouted through the comms. "Still alive," I grunted, glancing around the dimly lit space. My HUD adjusted, enhancing the low light to reveal a narrow corridor lined with old wiring and broken machinery. "Looks like I found their hideout. Stay put. We're coming to get you." "Negative," I said, already limping forward. "If they're down here, I'm not giving them time to run." "I'll keep comms open." The corridor twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the bowels of the city. Every step felt like a gamble, my rifle sweeping the darkness for signs of movement. Finally, I reached a small room, a makeshift command center filled with flickering screens and improvised tech. And that's when I saw it, a live feed from the surface, showing my squad's position in real time. They weren't just watching us. They were tracking us. Before I could process what that meant, the screens went dark, replaced by a single message in bold red letters: "Welcome to the game." My heart raced as the sound of footsteps echoed from behind me. I spun around, my rifle trained on the source, but the corridor was empty. Still, the feeling was undeniable. I wasn't alone. The red message on the screens burned into my mind: "Welcome to the game." I had no idea what it meant, but it didn't sound like an invitation to tea. The sound of footsteps behind me sent a chill down my spine, even as my HUD picked up nothing, no heat signatures, no movement alerts, just silence. "Vane, what's your status?" Vargas' voice crackled through the comms, more impatient than concerned. "I found something," I said, keeping my voice low. "A control room of some kind. Someone's been watching us, tracking us. Can you secure it?" "Negative. Feels like a trap," I replied, glancing at the flickering screens again. They'd shifted to a rotating series of static-laced feeds, each one showing different parts of the city. Some were streets we'd already swept. Others were areas I didn't recognize. "We're en route. Hold your position," Vargas ordered. "Copy," I muttered, but holding my position didn't feel like an option. Not when my instincts were screaming at me to move. The air felt heavier down here, thick with a metallic tang that clung to my throat. My leg throbbed with every step as I backed away from the screens, my rifle trained on the corridor I'd come through. If someone or something was down here with me, I wasn't planning on giving them the first shot. A faint hiss caught my attention, and I spun toward the sound. A side panel on the wall had slid open, revealing a narrow passage lit by dim, pulsing red lights. My HUD flagged it as new terrain, mapping it in real time as I approached. "Looks like I've got a new path," I said into the comms. "Permission to advance?" "Negative," Vargas snapped. "We don't know what's down there. Wait for backup." I hesitated, but only for a moment. If they were tracking us, every second wasted here was giving them the upper hand. "Acknowledged," I lied, stepping into the passage. The corridor felt like a living thing, the walls humming faintly as if the entire structure were alive. My HUD struggled to maintain a clear map, the signal flickering in and out like a bad hollow connection. The red lights pulsed in sync with my heartbeat, or maybe it just felt that way. Either way, it wasn't doing much for my nerves. At the end of the corridor, I found another room. This one was smaller, almost claustrophobic, and filled with what looked like storage pods. Each pod was about the size of a person, their surfaces sleek and black, with faint blue lines tracing their edges. My HUD flagged them as unknown tech. "Vargas, you seeing this?" I asked, sending a live feed to the squad. "Negative. Your signal's cutting out," he replied, his voice distorted. "Get back to the surface, Vane." "That's an order." "Copy," I said, but my curiosity was getting the better of me. Stepping closer to one of the pods, I reached out and brushed my fingers against its surface. It was cool to the touch, almost unnaturally so. A faint hum resonated from within, and for a moment, I could have sworn I heard someone moving inside. Before I could investigate further, a loud clang echoed from the corridor behind me. I spun around, my rifle at the ready, but the passage was empty. My HUD flared with a warning: "Motion detected." 15 meters. The noise grew louder, closer. Whatever was coming, it wasn't friendly. I retreated deeper into the room, my back pressed against one of the pods as I scanned for an exit. The footsteps stopped just outside the doorway, and for a moment, the silence was deafening. Then the lights went out. I activated my low-light vision, the room shifting into shades of green and gray. A shadow moved in the doorway, humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid, like a glitching hollow avatar. "Identify yourself," I demanded, my rifle locked on the figure. It didn't respond. Instead, it tilted its head, as if studying me before stepping forward. My HUD flared with a proximity alert, but the system couldn't classify it. No heat signature, no recognizable biometrics. Just an error message, unknown entity. I didn't wait for it to make the first move. My finger tightened on the trigger, and a burst of plasma rounds lit up the room. The figure moved faster than anything I'd ever seen, dodging the shots with an almost mechanical precision. It lunged toward me, and I barely had time to react, diving out of the way as its claws, yes, claws, slashed through the air where I'd been standing. Contact! I shouted into the comms, but the signal was dead. I was on my own. The fight was a blur. Every time I fired, it dodged. Every time it attacked, I barely avoided being skewered. My rifle's targeting system struggled to keep up, the reticle lagging behind its movements. I managed to land a glancing shot, and the thing let out a high-pitched screech that sent a shiver down my spine. Finally, I spotted an opening. As it lunged again, I sidestepped and drove the butt of my rifle into its head. It stumbled, and I followed up with a burst of plasma rounds to its chest. The creature collapsed, twitching and emitting a faint, static-like noise. I didn't stick around to see if it would get back up. Turning on my heel, I bolted down the nearest corridor, my leg protesting with every step. The passage twisted and turned, the walls narrowing until I felt like I was crawling through the veins of some massive beast. When I finally emerged, I found myself in another control room, but this one was different. The walls were lined with screens showing not just the city, but other locations, other squads. My HUD flagged some of the feeds as live, others as pre-recorded. In the center of the room was a single chair, and sitting in it was a man, or what was left of him. His body was more machine than flesh, wires snaking out from his back and plugging into the consoles around him. His eyes glowed faintly, a sickly green that made my stomach turn. "Welcome, Astra," he said, his voice distorted and hollow. "Who the hell are you?" I demanded, aiming my rifle at him. He smiled, or tried to. The expression didn't quite reach his eyes. "You've been chosen." "Chosen for what?" "To play the game," he replied, his head tilting slightly. "Survive and you win. Fail and, well, you've already seen what happens." I took a step forward, my rifle steady. "I don't play games." "You're already playing," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "And the clock is ticking." Before I could respond, the screens around the room flared to life, each one displaying a countdown. I glanced at my HUD, but it was glitching, the data unreadable. "What happens when the timer hits 0? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. His smile widened. "You'll find out." The next moments were chaos. The screens flickered, showing glimpses of my squad under attack, similar creatures to the one-eyed face swarming them. My comms came back to life, filled with shouts and static. "Vane, what the hell is going on?" Vargas demanded. "I'm in some kind of control center," I said, my voice strained. "There's a countdown. We're being hunted." "Hunted by what?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But they're fast, and they're not human." "Get back to the surface now," he ordered. "Working on it," I said, turning back to the man in the chair. "How do I stop this?" "You can't," he said simply. "But you can try to survive." The sound of my own breathing echoed loudly in the confined space of the control room. My rifle remained locked on the man, or machine, in the chair, but every instinct in me screamed that shooting him wouldn't stop whatever this was. "Vane, status update." Vargas barked over the comms, his voice crackling with urgency. "Still alive," I replied, trying to keep the quiver out of my voice. "But we've got a problem. Someone's running a twisted little showdown here, feeds, timers, traps. It's like they've turned this whole city into a hunting ground. Get topside." "Now," he ordered. I didn't need to be told twice. The man in the chair, his hollow eyes fixed on me, simply smiled as I backed toward the exit. "You can run, Astra," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "But you can't hide. They'll always find you." I stepped into the corridor, the red lights pulsing like a heartbeat. My HUD glitched with static, trying to map a way back out of this nightmare. Every step I took echoed too loudly, like the walls themselves were amplifying the sound, mocking my attempt at stealth. The air grew heavier with every meter, thick with the metallic tang of ozone and decay. Then, the countdown started. It began as a faint hum, low and mechanical, vibrating through the walls. My HUD flashed with an alert. Unknown signal detected. A timer appeared in the corner of my vision, counting down from 5 minutes. Whatever happened at 0, I was certain I didn't want to be around for it. "Command, I've got a timer on my HUD," I said, quickening my pace. 5 minutes and dropping. "What happens at 0? Vargas asked. "Don't know," I admitted, but something tells me it's not a fireworks show. The corridor twisted and turned, each corner looking more like the last. My neural link was barely holding a connection to my squad, the signal flickering in and out like a bad dream. I fought the rising panic, focusing on the path ahead. My HUD's low-light mode painted the space in shades of green and gray, every shadow a potential threat. The sound of footsteps echoed behind me, faint but unmistakable. My rifle snapped up, the targeting reticle scanning for movement. The air felt alive, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. "Contact," I whispered into the comms, though I didn't know what I was hearing yet. "Stay sharp," Vargas replied, as if I needed the reminder. I rounded a corner and nearly tripped over a body. One of the creatures from earlier sprawled across the floor in a pool of viscous black fluid. My HUD flagged it as non-hostile, but its limbs still twitched faintly, like it hadn't realized it was dead yet. A sound behind me, a low, guttural growl, sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. I spun, my rifle trained on the darkness, but nothing was there. The growl came again, closer this time, echoing through the corridor like a predator playing with its prey. "Vane, report." Vargas' voice cut through the tension. "Still moving," I said, backing away from the sound. "But I've got company." "How many?" "Hard to say. Feels like more than one." "Then keep moving," he ordered. "We'll meet you topside." Easier said than done. The growling grew louder, closer, until it wasn't just one sound but many, overlapping and distorted, like something straight out of a nightmare. My HUD flickered with proximity alerts, the system struggling to keep up with the chaotic movement in the shadows. I fired a burst into the darkness, the plasma rounds lighting up the corridor for a split second. Something darted out of sight, too fast for me to track. My heart pounded as I pressed forward, every nerve on edge. The corridor opened into a larger room, its walls lined with machinery that hummed faintly. In the center of the space stood another one of those pods, identical to the ones I'd seen earlier. This one was open. The growling stopped, replaced by a low, mechanical whirring. I turned slowly, my rifle sweeping the room. The sound grew louder, and then I saw it, a figure stepping out of the shadows, its body sleek and metallic, its eyes glowing a faint red. This one wasn't like the others. It moved with precision, its limbs too smooth, too deliberate. My HUD flagged it as hostile. High threat. "Well, that's just great," I muttered, gripping my rifle tighter. It lunged, faster than anything I'd faced before. I barely had time to dive out of the way, its claws slicing through the air where I'd been standing. I fired a burst into its side, but the rounds barely slowed it down. The thing turned, its glowing eyes locking onto me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. "Vane status," Vargas shouted. "Engaged with a high-threat hostile." I yelled back, rolling to my feet as the creature charged again. I ducked under its swipe, landing a shot to its leg that sent it stumbling. But it recovered too quickly, its movements almost robotic. My rifle beeped, a warning that I was running low on ammo. I cursed under my breath, backing toward the nearest exit. The creature followed, relentless, its claws scraping against the metal floor. Then, the timer hit 0. For a moment, everything stopped. The creature froze mid-step, its glowing eyes flickering as if it had lost power. The room fell silent, save for the faint hum of the machinery. I didn't wait to find out what was happening. Taking the opportunity, I bolted for the exit, my legs screaming in protest. As I ran, a new sound filled the air, a deep, resonating thrum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My HUD flared with a new alert. Signal restored. Multiple hostiles inbound. "Vargas, something's happening." I shouted into the comms. The timer hit 0, and now everything's going crazy. "We're tracking you," he replied. "Get to the extraction point." Now, the corridors blurred together as I ran. the sound of distant screeches and mechanical whirring pushing me forward. Whatever the timer had triggered, it wasn't just one or two hostiles. It was all of them. I burst into the open air, the city's neon glow almost blinding after the oppressive darkness below. My squad was waiting near the extraction zone, their weapons trained on the entrance I'd just emerged from. "Move, Vane," Vargas shouted, his cybernetic eye glowing faintly as he waved me toward the transport. I didn't need to be told twice. Sprinting toward the waiting vehicle, I threw myself inside just as the first of the creatures emerged from the corridor. Plasma rounds lit up the night as my squad opened fire, cutting down the hostiles with brutal efficiency. The transport roared to life, its engines vibrating beneath me as we sped away from the scene. I slumped against the wall, my heart pounding as I tried to process what had just happened. "What the hell was that?" Bishop asked, his rifle still in hand. "Something new," I said, staring out the window as the city lights blurred past. "And something tells me it's not over."